Hope you're making the most of your lockdown weekend around the world. This is a time to reboot, re energize, and perhaps collate knowledge from around the world to help navigate our way through these particularly turbulent times. On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome to GLF's Brave New World. Those of you who missed our earlier sessions, including yesterday's brilliant conversation with Peter Morgan, award winning playwright, screenwriter, and the writer behind the enormously popular award winning series The Crown, in conversation with Ritesh Batra, the director of the award winning film The Lunchbox, as well as writers like Margaret Atwood, Piku Iyer, Siddharth Mukherjee, Tina Brown, Peter Carey, Jhumpa Lahiri, James Mallison, Shubha Mudgal, Edmund DeWall, Kiran Mazumdar Shaw, and many others. You can catch them on our Facebook page, JLF Lit Fest, or on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Lit Fest JLF. To tell you more about JLF's Brave New World, please welcome festival directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple.
Friends of books, friends of literature, friends of the festival, it is an absolute delight to watch the enthusiasm with which our new initiative, JLF, Brave New World, has been received. Our stellar sessions are around books, around ideas, and around coping mechanisms which help us understand the uncertainties, the surprises, and indeed the shocks of our time. Do tune in, do listen in, do engage as we search for this brave new world.
Hi there, we've put together an incredible literary festival for you online, JLF Brave New World. All the writers we love most at Jaipur, Peter Frankopan, Jhumpa Lahiri, Margaret Atwood, have been joined by a whole galaxy of stars we've never dreamt of actually getting to the festival. People like Peter Carey, Edmund DeWall, Alain de Botton. It's an incredible lineup. Orhan Pamuk, Neil Gaiman, really, it just goes on and on and on. Come and join us, Brave New World, every Wednesday, Saturday and Sunday evening on a phone or laptop near you.
Thank you, Namita. Thank you, William. Our official radio partner is Red FM Bajate Raho. Our first session today on JLF's Brave New World is going viral. Two eminent scientists examine the front lines of the world's battle with COVID-19 virus and share their perspectives on different dimensions of the pandemic. Roger Highfield in conversation with Ajit Lalvani. Roger Highfield is the science director of the Science Museum Group. Prior to joining the National Museum of Science and Industry, he was editor of the New Scientist magazine, and prior to that, the award-winning science editor of the Daily Telegraph, where he worked for more than 20 years. He's also a regular on radio and television and has organized mass participation experiments with the BBC. He's at the leading edge of the integration of web and print and has starred in a series of web videos about everyday science. Highfield was the first person to bounce a neutron off a soap bubble. He has written, co-authored 7 popular science books, all of which have been translated into foreign editions, including After Dolly, The Science of Harry Potter, The Physics of Christmas, The Private Lives of Complexity, and Why We Need Each Other to Succeed. He's presently also a visiting professor at UCL and the University of Oxford. Ajit Lalvani is chair of infectious diseases and director of the National Respiratory Infectious Health Protection Research Unit at the National Heart and Lung Institute, Imperial College London, and Imperial College Healthcare NHS Trust. His research program addresses the world's most serious respiratory infections, including tuberculosis and pandemic influenza. At Imperial, he founded the multidisciplinary Tuberculosis Research Center, one of Europe's leading tuberculosis research groups. His research has transformed our understanding of the natural history of TB infection and the mechanism of action of BCG vaccine, as well as providing fundamental new insights into protective immunity to TB, pandemic influenza, and malaria. His ongoing research program probes the immunologic and genetic factors that shape the natural history and clinical outcomes of TB and influenza infection, while maintaining a strong translation theme by developing and validating novel biomarkers of infectious diseases and treatment response. His scientific insight into COVID-19 has been given an extra depth of perspective after recently contracting the virus himself. Ladies and gentlemen, Roger Highfield and Ajit Lalvani, going viral.
Thank you so much, Sanjoy. Pleasure to be here. And bad news wrapped up in a protein. It just measures like 1,000th of a diameter of a human hair across. So far, we've had millions of cases worldwide, something like 250,000 deaths. The good news is that there's an unprecedented mobilization of scientists, engineers, technicians, mathematicians worldwide to deal with the threat. And among them is Ajit, of course. Ajit, I should say, how are you feeling today? And tell us a little bit about what it was like, what your encounter with COVID-19 was like.
I'm feeling very well now, thankfully, Roger. Thank you. My illness began on March the 12th, actually all of a sudden with a fever. I was walking home from work and feeling surprisingly cold, although it wasn't a particularly cold evening, and didn't really know why. And then it was, by the time I went to bed that night, I had a fever, which by the next morning was 39.5. And it started on a significant day, at least for the United Kingdom, because March the 12th was the day that the government decided to stop testing in the community. So it had given up on its strategy to contain the epidemic in the UK through testing, tracing, and isolation. So a very significant day, actually, it was. Yeah.
I think it's an interesting day as well, because at about that time, if not a day beforehand, all the modelers in the UK had concluded that if the government was going to prevent the NHS from being overwhelmed, they only had one option at their disposal, which was a lockdown. So it was a very momentous time.
Yes, that came a little bit later. That came, about 5 days later, a soft lockdown, recommendations, followed by a legally enforceable absolute lockdown about 5 more days after that. And I've never really known an illness like this. It's probably the illest I've ever been. In fact, it's certainly the illest I've ever been. And there was almost a week of unrelenting fever of 39.5. But by the end of the first week, I was feeling better, and I actually resumed work and thought I was over it. But then 24 hours later, I relapsed and the fever came back. And if anything, this time, although the muscle aches and pains that I'd been suffering from didn't come back so badly, the illness certainly returned with quite a full force. I was just as exhausted as I'd been in the first week, maybe more so, and I began to cough up blood, which clearly was an indication that something was not right in my lungs.
Just contrast it with, some people in a slightly offhand way say, oh, it's like a bad cold, or it's like influenza. Obviously you're an expert respiratory diseases. What are the kind of patterns that you get with colds and influenza, and how do they compare with COVID?
Well, colds are usually just a few days and you don't get much of a fever or systemic symptoms. It's mostly runny nose, sore throat, itchy eyes and so on. With the flu, you certainly get a fever and you get muscle aches, cramps, what we call myalgias, but the fever doesn't really go beyond 5 days. So COVID-19 is a very distinct illness. And as an infectious disease specialist, I've treated many different types of infections over the years, including, unusual tropical infections imported from various places around the world. But I've never known a clinical syndrome like COVID. And certainly there's no respiratory virus, and in fact, no viruses at all, really, that give you a 2-week illness like this. And in the end, after I relapsed, I had that fever back again for the full 14 days, and was coughing blood for more than a week. But luckily I didn't get short of breath and didn't require intensive care.
And tell me about your oxygen levels, because one of the strange features of COVID is that you can really have quite low oxygen levels. You can be what they say is hypoxic, and yet you get this phrase, the happy hypoxics, that people are actually have quite low oxygen levels, but they don't seem to realize there's a problem.
Yeah, well, I was thinking through what I should do, in my condition, and wondered about going to hospital. But I thought, really, what would I learn in hospital? A CT scan would just show infiltration, shadowing in both the lungs, tell me that I've got a typical COVID sort of pneumonia, as we call it, with the typical pattern on a CT scan, but that's not going to really help the management. I thought really the only thing that really would help to know would be my oxygen level. To know that would be very helpful, because if it was very low, I should probably go to hospital and get oxygen treatment. And if it wasn't too low, I could continue to manage at home. So I was pleased to see that from Amazon, I could get a pulse oximeter delivered within a day, check my oxygen level, and for a couple of days, it was 93%, which is pretty low and actually indicates that it's severe COVID-19, and would perhaps under usual circumstances, if I weren't a physician myself, would mandate going to hospital and possibly into intensive care. But I had the good fortune not only of being a physician myself, but also of having good friends who are by now expert in COVID-19. A friend of mine in Italy was managing all the COVID cases in Rome, which by that time he'd seen hundreds of cases. And another colleague who trained in my research laboratory in Oxford some years ago was now a professor in Beijing and had managed 200 doctors and nurses at the Wuhan front. So she'd also seen a lot of COVID-19, and they would check in on me twice a day. And we worked out that I could, in the event, it worked out fine. I managed myself at home without going into hospital. But I think those two colleagues were keeping a very close eye on me, and I think it was good that it could be joint decision making rather than me just making the decision alone.
Do we have any idea what leads to this huge variation in symptoms, with quite a few people being infected and yet having no symptoms, some going to rapid decline, some have this biphasic illness, and then of course some perish because of this phenomenon called a cytokine storm, when you get a sort of overreaction of the immune system? Do we have any insights into what leads to those astonishing differences?
So that's a really fascinating question. And in fact, that's the question which, in the case of tuberculosis and influenza, first got me interested in these two other infections, because they are obviously, flu causes pandemics every few decades, and TB is itself an ongoing chronic pandemic. And in both of those conditions, as with COVID, you have a very wide range of outcomes following infection. And what's clear with COVID-19 is that the infecting virus, SARS-CoV-2 as it's known, isn't very different in terms of it's not genetic changes in the virus that are causing these different, what we call clinical outcomes or manifestations that you so vividly described, Roger. Rather, it's the host immune response. So it's the way different individuals' bodies respond to the infection and how they handle it. That determines whether someone is going to have a symptom-free infection, have a mild set of symptoms, or moderate to severe, as in my case, or very severe and end up in hospital, even more severe on intensive care. And so the key to unlocking that mystery really is to understand the body's immune response. And that's why, as you know, I've repurposed my entire team of immunologists, epidemiologists, respiratory physicians and nurses. I've repurposed the entire team to now work on COVID-19 and to help find some meaningful solutions, scientific solutions to the pandemic. And the first big question we're focusing on is exactly this, is exactly trying to work out why different people respond so differently to the same virus and have this wide range of outcomes. Mm-hmm.
And tell me, you've got three, I think, big questions, haven't you? I think the proportion of infections that are symptom-free, the risk factors that promote or impede transmission of COVID, and whether these early immune responses, you could actually predict the fate of a patient. Before you just tell me a little bit more about how you're going to do the study, people got quite anxious a few days ago about anecdotal reports from South Korea that were taken quite seriously of people being reinfected. And obviously, one of the big issues is how long immunity to the virus lasts and how long you could shrug off another encounter with the virus. But it sounds like that was a false alarm now, doesn't it, from newer information?
Well, first, let's think about why reinfection, if it's happening, is important. Why are people concerned about it? And the answer is this, that with the infection having been around only 4 months in the world, if people are already getting reinfected, then that means that their immunity after a first infection is either absent or very short-lived. So it's very important to know if reinfection is happening, because if it is, it's bad news for the type of immunity that we get afterwards, which in turn is bad news for developing vaccines. But we've looked very carefully at this question for that reason, and there's no good evidence yet that people are clearly getting reinfected. There are certain criteria to define when someone has properly cleared the virus and then, definitively got reinfected, and those haven't been met yet in the reports that we read about here and there around the world. Was your first question about my study and the questions?
Yes, I think we understand the sort of questions you're looking at. Just give us a flavor of how you design this kind of study to investigate this mystery of the immune response, and when you expect to get some results.
Yeah, well, look, let me tell you first, why does it matter to understand why would we want to understand how the immune response results in such a wide spectrum of clinical outcomes? Obviously, it's of great scientific interest. It's a real mystery, and it will be great to find it out. It's a bit of a scientific quest, but it's also practically a sort of holy grail, because if you can identify which immune responses are associated with the best outcomes, minimal symptoms or no symptoms at all, those are the immune responses that are protecting people. And those, therefore, are the immune responses that an effective vaccine should induce. And if you can identify those immune responses, what we call correlates of protection, you can then guide and accelerate vaccine development. And we hope to have results of that type within a few months, by which time, late summer, many vaccines will be entering clinical trials. And this will help to, if you like, guide which vaccines should be progressed and which shouldn't, because we'd have identified by then, hopefully, what are the right protective immune responses that should be induced. But to answer that question, to find those immune responses is quite a piece of work. You see, most investigators around the world are studying patients with severe disease, and we're finding many weird and wonderful immune phenomena. And indeed, those help to account for some of the symptoms and clinical manifestations of this weird and wonderful 2-week illness that it causes. They're not going to tell us, studies like that are just sort of going to tell you what are the immune responses associated with being very ill with COVID. They're not going to tell you what immune responses one should have had in the first place to prevent you getting that ill. So to answer that question, we need to study people who've recently been exposed to the virus before they've gone on to develop symptoms. And that means we have to study household contacts. So our study is going to recruit 300 newly diagnosed cases of COVID-19 in the community, so recruited through general practices in London, who are being extremely cooperative and very enthused by the study, I might say. And then to approach those newly diagnosed cases and offer to screen their households, so to screen all the family members, and on day one, to go and visit them. My research nurses will go to their homes, swab the patient again, swab all the contacts to see if they've acquired the infection already, and take blood samples. And then we will revisit the households on day 5, 8, and 28. So by doing this, we'll be able to correlate the early immune responses with whether these household contacts firstly develop infection, Secondly, whether they develop a symptomatic infection. And thirdly, whether their infection is highly infectious. So we'll be able to measure all those things, and we'll be able to identify those early immune responses soon after exposure that predict who's going to have the best outcomes. And in that way, we'll find which immune responses tell you who's might get infected but not develop any symptoms at all. And since not all household contacts get infected, we don't know what proportion, but maybe around a third to a half, then that also raises the interesting question, what's happening in those half or more household contacts in the same environment, breathing the air, but actually the same infected air, but somehow resisting infection altogether. So we might also find the immune responses that could help to prevent infection in the first place.
I mean, you alluded to the fact that it's going to take you some time to put this puzzle together, and hopefully it will inform the vaccine development. I think there's 140 different vaccines being developed around the planet. But you did a study like this with influenza a few years ago, and you got some interesting insights there, which give you a sort of a taste of what we hope to learn from your study. Could you just tell me a little bit more about that?
With pleasure. Yeah, it was so that was in 2009 during the so-called swine flu pandemic, which was had some important similarities to COVID-19 because it was a new virus. You know, COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2 is a new type of coronavirus. Swine flu was a new type of flu virus. But the key thing in common that they had was that being new, none of the world's population had ever seen that virus before. So everyone lacked immunity, and everyone was what we term immunologically naive to the new virus. So in that sense, the situation was rather similar. But with swine flu, as with COVID, a large proportion of people developed symptom-free infection. In fact, a larger proportion than with COVID. And yet they were getting infected but not having symptoms. So we designed a somewhat similar study at the time with similar research questions in mind. And we recruited healthy volunteers who were getting exposed to the swine flu as it swept through London in the autumn of 2019, late summer, early autumn. And we measured their baseline immunity to the virus. And then we correlated their baseline immunity with their clinical outcomes. So really the same research question, what were the immune responses, the pre-existing immune responses they already had that would predict a good versus a bad outcome for them? And we cracked that particular nut. We found it was a particular type of killer T cell in the blood that was effective at seeking out and destroying the flu virus in their bodies and thereby preventing them from suffering symptoms. And that was actually, that was described as the sort of finding the holy grail in immunity to flu. And it set out the blueprint for developing a pre-pandemic universal flu vaccine. In other words, if you could induce those types of T cells, you'd be able to protect yourself against future types of flu that no one's immune system has yet seen, including lethal types of flu such as bird flu.
Well, I know we're going to open up to questions in a few minutes' time. But for the final part of our chat, I'd like to talk about exit strategies. And I guess all governments now are thinking about relaxing lockdown measures, and some of them are starting to do it. And I guess the basic problem they face is that to achieve so-called herd immunity, where say something like 60% of the population has immunity to the virus, that's assuming that it persists and so on. By one estimate, in the UK alone, we've exposed something like 15% of the population, and we're heading for 40,000, 50,000 deaths. To reach herd immunity that way is almost unthinkable. So how can you see us getting out of this situation where we have a very, very blunt instrument of control to keep a lid on the pandemic?
Yeah, well, of course, this is the fundamental question. And let me take a broad approach to the answer, if I may, Roger, considering the sort of intellectual breadth of participation in the Jaipur Literary Festival audience, and begin by saying a couple of things. I think the first is this pathogen that we're facing is about the nastiest type of pathogen you could devise, if you were to devise one, because it's more infectious than pandemic flu, which is itself hugely infectious. It's about 20 to 30 times more lethal than pandemic flu in terms of its case fatality rate. And horribly, it becomes infectious even before people have symptoms. And I remember actually the day before I became ill. No, in fact, it was the day I became ill, March the 12th, before leaving my office at St. Mary's Hospital. I read a preprint of a paper, and this was the first time I'd ever read a scientific paper that actually left me feeling depressed. And the paper pointed out for the first time that people with COVID-19 are infectious for 2 days before they even develop symptoms. And this just makes it extremely difficult to control. So we should be under no illusion as to what a serious enemy this is. And I think when people see the death rates accruing around the world, they are left in no illusion about that. And I think overall, there are three key attributes of humanity that lead me to feel that there is an end in sight and that we will find a solution. And I think the first of these is that human beings have had over millennia a great capacity to endure a lot of suffering. And this pandemic is causing that, and it's going to go on causing that. And if it gets a head of steam behind it in the developing world, it'll cause it on an unimaginable scale. The second attribute, I think, of humanity is adaptability. We're an extraordinarily adaptable species, and we've adapted to all kinds of situations in the past. And with that comes resilience. So I think this means that we will be able to, we've got capacity for suffering, as we've seen, we've got capacity to adapt and cope with situations and perhaps be more resilient than we imagine. And thirdly and lastly, there's a lot of ingenuity. Humankind is very ingenious. And you see this at times, particularly when we're under the greatest threat. You look at each of the world wars, the rate of innovation, of inventions, of advancement of science in those 5-year bursts is phenomenal. And that's exactly what we're seeing now globally. So that brings me to have a high level of confidence that we will develop an effective vaccine to this infection, and probably that we'll have fast-acting effective drugs. But the vaccine is more crucial, and I have a high level of confidence that we'll get there. But getting there is going to be about a year or more. Best estimates, a year to a year and a half. Mm-hmm. So the question really, and your question was, what are we going to do in the meantime? Because we can't remain in lockdown for a year to a year and a half until the vaccine comes. And so really we need to begin to release the lockdown. And how do we do it? And I think here we need to recognize that what's happening, what's about to happen, what's just begun to happen actually in some countries, is a series of enormous scale national experiments, because no one knows the right way out of the lockdown. Every country is trying its own technique, trying its best. But really, we're all sort of learning by doing in this scenario. And it's not at all clear what the right approach is going to be, although there are some important principles, and I'll come to them just now. And I think they are that we're going to need to have a lot of testing capacity, because now that we've got the transmission rates low in societies that have experienced lockdown, as we take the brakes off the lockdown, we need to detect where cases occur, who they may have transmitted to, and isolate the cases and quarantine the contacts. You could draw an analogy, if you like, to as we raise the lockdown, as we lift the lockdown, we'll see little bushfires occurring here and there, little campfires, and we'll need to quickly put them out before they get bigger. And above all, we need to put them out before they get bigger and coalesce and cause a firestorm like we had before. Because when you have the firestorm, all you can do is the lockdown. So this approach, we need to learn from countries that have done it successfully, such as South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Germany. And what it requires is massive testing capacity. Secondly, technology in the form of mobile phone apps to accelerate the contact tracing. Thirdly, what's often forgotten is it requires a veritable army of contact tracers to go out and identify individuals who've been exposed and put them in quarantine. And then it also requires imaginative thinking, because if you ask a person who's got COVID infection to self-isolate at home, realistically, how will that person stop infecting their household members? If they live in a 16-room mansion, it may be possible. If they live in a one-bedroom flat in London or one room in a slum in Bombay, it's simply not possible. So we need to think laterally about where we can put people if we're serious about isolating and quarantining them. And then the other thing it's going to require at an unprecedented level is cooperation and coordination between policymakers, health systems, and the people, the public, because this is going to require massive buy-in by the public to cooperate with this. And in the end, I think the best place for this army of contact tracers to come from is going to be within communities themselves, because they will understand the local populations, they'll be trusted by the local populations, and they'll be able to help them to endure, 2 weeks of quarantine despite whatever social or other challenges they may have. And lastly, what it's going to require is a lot of international cooperation and humility. And by humility, I mean we need to learn from each country that is a week or two ahead of the others. And I think, some countries, the UK and the US, lost opportunities to learn from what they were seeing, because they had, despite all the science and scientific advice we have and give and so on, and models, we had empirical evidence in front of us in the shape of South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong on the one hand, and Italy and Spain on the other. And the UK and the US had the luxury of being able to watch the difference in those two scenarios. And those were real life, national scale experiments to learn from. And I think, I hope that as we exit lockdown, we will learn the lessons from other countries. And again, as countries are lifting lockdown, we can see what's happening and learn best practice, as it were, from each of these countries. So that requires a lot of international cooperation and humility, preparedness to learn from each other, despite nationalistic pride. And I think on that point, having described what I've just described and thinking back to the title of the whole program of the Jaipur Literary Festival, what this really amounts to is a brave new world.
I completely agree. For Ajit, I've got a colleague at University College London who is cooperating with 5 US government labs. I think the University of Chicago, they're using the biggest supercomputer on the planet, which is in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. They're using the biggest supercomputer in the EU, Supermuck near Garching, all engaged in the hunt, across continents for lead compounds for anti-COVID drugs. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. So that certainly gives me reason for hope. I've got the first few questions up in front of me. There's one from Eli Chanikal Joseph Thomas, talking about, has it been confirmed that even those who've been cured of COVID-19 have suffered a recurrence? And actually, we did allude to that. In South Korea, they looked into what they thought was recurrence, and now they think it was more likely to be a testing artifact rather than a real phenomenon. So that's very good news indeed. There's another question here from Sachdev Ramakrishna for you, Ajit. He says he's very glad to hear that you're recovering well, and then talks about the symptoms in India, with some new symptoms being reported, repeated shaking with chills, loss of taste and smell. Is this a new list of lesser known symptoms? And is it usual? Are we learning this every day? I mean, certainly I know the symptoms are quite diverse and quite long. And I seem to remember that loss of taste and smell is quite common, isn't it?
It is quite common, and it's very specific as well, because there are very few illnesses that give you a loss of taste and smell. It's really remarkable, and I experienced that too. But let's not forget, the commonest symptom is fever and cough that's usually dry. And then, yes, this loss of taste and symptoms. And I had loss of taste and sense of smell. And there's a whole range of weird and wonderful symptoms being caused, and the coughing up of blood, as I experience, is due to a phenomenon that no other infection we know causes, which is that this infection causes small blood clots in the periphery of the lungs, which is part of the reason that oxygen levels can go so low. So there's a lot of new phenomena that this virus is causing that are just completely new to medicine. I mean, it's whilst being absolutely horrendous as an illness, it's also deeply, scientifically and medically fascinating for people such as me who work in the field.
There's another question here, actually addressed to me, talking about science popularization, my work at the Daily Telegraph, and popularizing science among children with my Science of Harry Potter book. How do we build scientific temperance in a society a bit removed from a belief-based one? Well, it's a huge question. I'm going to not dig into that, other than to say things like this event and putting people in touch with people like Ajit, who are actually at the cutting edge of science, is a phenomenal way of helping people understand, when scientists talk about their new results and their new insights, they're built on incredibly clever, detailed, exhaustive studies. It's a very tough environment in science where ideas are constantly challenged and tested and so on. And I think, to put it another way, what's going to get us out of the COVID-19 pandemic is not going to be the politicians. It's going to be the scientists and the technologists, the engineers, and so on. There's a question here.
Sorry to interrupt, Roger, but if I may just quickly respond to that question of myself, just to really say to them that amongst all the science writers I've met, you, Roger, are the most engaging and best, actually, by far. I mean, and I would recommend this audience, if you're interested in learning about the science of COVID-19 as an interested, lay, non-specialist person, I think there are few better places to go than the Science Museum coronavirus blog, which Roger publishes every week. I think tomorrow is the 6th blog, and they are really so engaging. There, he interviews many people, covers a lot of area, and brings deep scientific principles he folds them into the stories. So really, congratulations to you, Roger, on that.
Thank you. That's incredibly kind. But before I get carried away, actually, here's one for you that I know a lot of people will be asking. Om Prakash Parikh asks, the immune system, the immune response of an infective individual plays a significant role. Is there any way to boost your immune response to fight the virus in the short run?
So, look, that's a very good question. And the thing is that in order to do that, there are immune responses that develop in the body specifically in response to the virus, and they take about a week or more to develop, and those are antibodies and T cells, all of which we've heard of. And those are the immune responses that my study, which is called Instinct, is going to identify. So it's great to boost immunity, but the thing is you need to know which immune responses to boost. And that's what our study aims to do. If you boost immune responses willy-nilly, like a sort of blunderbuss or shotgun approach, you can run the risk of causing too much inflammation. And as you alluded to earlier, Roger, this phenomenon of cytokine storm that can cause people in the second week of COVID-19 to die from a sort of inflammatory shock to the body, that is too much immunity gone haywire. So one needs to be careful. That said, early on in infection, there are simple ways to boost the innate immune system. One of those is vitamin D, and there's a lot of intense interest in whether vitamin D might be able to help prevent infection. And there are clinical trials, large ones going on, of healthcare workers to see if vitamin D can help people to, prevent them getting infected in the first place. And that vitamin D, I should mention for those who don't know, is a stimulant of the innate immune system.
Well, I think we've got time just for one more question, Ajit. And I should say, this kind of virus, it's a so-called RNA virus, and these viruses are notorious for mutating. And Veena Devaya asks, now they're talking about a link between coronavirus and Kawasaki disease and skin ailments. Is the virus mutating? Well, we certainly know it is, but I don't think there's any evidence that it's getting any nastier. And I seem to remember, Ajit, that if anything, we'd expect it to get milder over a long time, wouldn't we?
Yeah, over a long time, we would expect it to get milder. That usually happens when a new highly pathogenic virus enters human beings and transmits. That happens over time, but it happens over a scale of years, usually not weeks or months. Indeed, the virus is mutating, and I thought it was very nicely, but the question is whether these mutations have any consequence or not yet. That was very nicely summarized in your blog last week, Roger, where you interviewed the Icelandic founder of Decode Genetics, who's sequenced more strains of the virus than anyone else so far and published them. And he said, yes, it's mutating all the time, but there's no evidence that any of those mutations has any biological consequence yet, which I think is a nice, succinct way of putting it.
Genetic code, it's a tiny thing. And when they compare it with lots of other viruses, even though there have been slightly wild claims that it's... Ajit, are you into the lab-made virus conspiracy theory camp, or the it's yet another example animals into humans?
I mean, I'd be able to tell that it had been tampered with in terms of its nucleic